Hi, it's Jo from Minerva. I'm here today to show you how to make some bias binding. It's a great skill to have. You can use it on edgings, you can use it in places where it's not on a pattern, but if you can match that to your fabric that you've chosen, it can make a really nice finish. I'm trying to make some more solid coloured items because otherwise I could end up making a handmade wardrobe where nothing matches anything else. So today I'm going to make a white top for summer, and I'm going to add bias binding around the edges, and I want it to have a really good finish. The fabric I'm using today is a soft linen cotton mix viscose, which is really good for summer wear. It's quite lightweight, it's described as medium, but you can just sort of see your hand through it. It's got a really nice linen finish. There you can see the little bit of texture on it, and it gathers really well. It's got that element of viscose in it that gives it a really good drape. The tool I'm going to use is a bias binding maker, and you feed the fabric through here and then you press it as it comes out the other side, and I'll show you how to use that on the ironing board. Making your own bias binding is useful for woven fabrics where you've got no stretch going across the grain. If you're making a jersey binding like on this top here, you won't use one of these because you'll work with the stretch of the fabric. The pattern that really drew me in for making my own bias binding was Tilly and the Buttons Fifi pyjama set, because I needed to make bias binding that went around the bust and over to make the strap. So it's a useful skill to have so that you can make your own straps, but you can also bind at the same time. So that's a really great way to hone your bias binding making skills. Okay, over at the cutting table, we need to make sure that we're getting our fabric on a 45-degree angle. So I've taken the corner of my fabric, which was over here, and I've folded it up to make a right angle here. And that means that you get this really lovely bit of stretch of the fabric. And you can't cut neck bias binding without cutting your material on that bias, and you have to be careful that you don't cut your fabric requirement down and just put these along the straight grain, because you won't get that stretch. So here, look, it's not going to stretch. So when you go around a curve, your fabric won't curve around it, or you'll get lots and lots of little ripples, and I'll show you that on a real garment. Here's an example of a neckline that wasn't cut on the bias, and this is a cotton dobby fabric, which is a cotton with a thread running through it. But you can see that here you get a sort of ripple here, and that's because the fabric can't go round the curve, it's fighting against the straight grain. So when you put it on, you get a neckline, but you get this ripple effect. You can see it around there. Here's an example where some was cut on the bias and some wasn't. So this top has a tie that goes round the neck, and you can see that because it was cut on the bias, then this viscose curves right round that neckline really beautifully. But I didn't have enough fabric to cut on the bias, and this is what happens when it's not going around the curve. It's fighting against you under the machine, so your machines keep slipping off the edge and you get quite a bad finish. So there you can see I've not got a really nice top stitching. So those armholes are not cut on the bias, but the neckline is, and that's what's lying nice and flat, and it's going around this keyhole curve as well. You might also use your homemade bias, or your one you're going to make yourself, to match round a sleeve. This one is machine stitched on, right sides to right sides, then folded over and hand stitched on. That's quite a sort of vintage technique. But again, if your handmade bias isn't cut on the bias of the fabric, it won't curve around there. It'll fight you down here where that stronger curve is. You can cut out your bias binding with scissors, but it is easier to use a rotary cutter. This one's an alpha one, and I like it because you can have the blade open and you can very easily close it off so that you can make sure that it's safe. Sell blades for that as well. If you're using a rotary cutter, you need rotary cutter mats because you will damage your table and you won't be able to keep your blade in good condition. But a rotary cutter is really useful for cutting bias binding because it's not shifting then when you're lifting it up. You can keep it as flat as possible. I'm going to press this before I finally cut it out, but I want to try and get my strips as flat as possible. The top I'm making has a front neck all the way around and ties at the back. It has some armhole tapes that go all the way around, and it has one that goes around the neck as well. So this one goes around the back, around a keyhole shape. I'm going to cut that out, then I'm going to show you how to turn it into bias binding with the edges folded over. If you're not feeling as confident, you might want to invest in a ruler so that you can run your rotary cutter along the side of a ruler. That also helps you to get really nice straight bias binding. Okay, I'm going to show you how to make your own bias binding with a set of bias binding makers. Really useful tool. It stops you burning your fingers on the iron when you're trying to fold the narrow sides in of the bias binding. There's a little bit of preparation. You feed your piece of fabric that you've cut on the bias through the bias binding maker. So you put it through this hole at the wide end, and you might just need to use just a pin or a pair of tweezers just to get it to flick out of that end. And then you pin it to your ironing board so it doesn't move, and then you can flip up the handle, and that's the bit that stops you burning your fingers. And then you're going to gently, not quickly, gently pull the binder along. And as you pull the binder along, you're going to just do a press with the iron. Don't drag it about too much, because remember that piece of fabric is quite volatile because it's been cut on the bias, so you just need to keep a press on it rather than dragging it along. And you need to keep a little bit of tension on the tail that's coming out so that it doesn't twist. So as you can see, it's folded down both edges like a piece of bias binding that you would buy, but you get to have a piece that's pattern matching your fabrics. I've just used white today so that I can show you easily. Okay, to join two pieces of bias binding, because you'd have to waste quite a lot of fabric to cut on the bias really long strips, so you might need to join a few pieces. You're going to put two pieces at right angles and you're going to sew from one corner of your box to the other. So I'm just going to pin that. And you're going to sew from here to here, and then you can snip that off, and then you will get it to run straight when it's opened out. When you've sewn across the end, you trim it back and press this seam open, and then you can just run it back through the bias binding maker just to make sure that you're getting the same width throughout. And then from the right side, you shouldn't really be able to see it, there's a line that goes along there. You can't sew it end to end because when you open it out it will be at the wrong angle, so that's how you make an invisible line to join two pieces of bias binding together. If you're not making bias binding, you can buy it from us, and it comes in different types of fabric. So this is a sateen one, something a bit more luxurious. You can get cotton ones if you're just using to face an armhole. You can get decorative ones. You can also get some nice coloured fabrics, so if you mix it with a plain fabric. So there's ready-made ones that you can buy from us as well, and they're tagged below. Okay, this is the first way that you can apply bias binding. I like doing this way. This is the wrong side of the fabric because there's my seam, and I'm going to put the right side of the bias along the wrong side of the neckline, and I'm going to use the little fold as my sewing line. So I've got the right side of the bias to the wrong side of the neckline, and then I'm going to sew all the way along there, and then I'm going to flip it over to the right side. So I'll continue to pin this, then I'm going to sew it, and I'll show you how it turns over onto the right side to get the neckline finish. Okay, the bias binding is attached, so we've got the wrong side of the fabric with the right side of the binding, and then we're going to roll it over and pin it. It's a bit snug, so I'm just going to go and trim some of the seam allowance off around the neck, and then I'll be able to roll it forward really effectively and get a really nice flat edge. The joy of this technique can now be seen once all the preparation's done. So once you've put the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the top, pinned it, sewed it, layered out the seam, you then fold it over to the front, and now your finish line is sewn from the front, so you're going to see exactly what the front edge of your binding is going to look like. There's no mysteries, it can't just slop off the edge. You're the one in control of what it's going to look like from the right side. Okay, so there's the first technique. You can see that the sewing went round the neck and then continued on to make the tie for the back. It's a great fabric because when you've pressed it, you can't even see the joins. It presses out really nicely, which means that you get really good darts as well because they've pressed out really well. Okay, so there's the back. It ties here in a bow. I'm going to show you a different way to apply binding around the armholes. You might have in your little kit of sewing feet a binding foot, and that's what it looks like. fits on the machine there, and then it's got a bracket that you put the binding in, and I'll show you quickly how that works just in case you've got one and you didn't know how to use it. Okay, I'm going to do my best to show you this binding foot. I don't use it very often, but I do know how to use it. There is a little slit here. You see my tweezers going in, and that is where the main fabric is going to go in. And then here is a sort of tube of plastic that the binding is going to feed through. So you need to just secure it with one pin just so that you can stop it all slipping around. And then you're going to put the binding through the big hole and the fabric through this slit, like this. Next, there's a little wheel here, and you're going to pinch that up to the width of your binding so that the binding runs along that little runner that you're guiding. So now I've got the fabric, the binding fed through, and I've got the little guide marking where to hold the binding, and then we can start sewing. If it's not quite coming through, if you just hold the tail threads and just gently pull those through, it will get it onto the feed dogs and start to gradually pull it through the machine. And then you're going to keep that lined up, and you're going to keep folding the binding over the edge, and you're going to keep the binding lined up. And it does it in one pass. And there we are, it's super quick. That's the advantage of it. It catches the fabric on both sides. The only thing is you can't get quite as close to the edge as I could on the neckline, but it's really quick and effective. So if you've got a bias binding foot, get it out of the box and have a little go with it. I finished off the other armhole, joined up the sides, and I've got a really great summer top that I can wear with a lot of things. And you can see that the really neat binding has made a really neat top. So the binding goes round the armholes, round the neck, and then it follows the neck round to make the tie at the back. And if you can make your own bias binding, then you can customise any vest top, any summer top by adding different bindings. Also, if you've got a little bit of your favourite fabric left over but not enough to make anything, you can fold it on the diagonal, the 45-degree diagonal, and cut out binding, and then you get to have a little bit of that special fabric mixed with another one. If you're thinking of getting some new tools for your sewing kit, then it's a really good idea to join the Minerva Club, because there will be discounts. So if you're looking to invest in some new tools and bits of kit, it's a great way to save some pennies. Thanks for watching. All the products that you've seen in today's tutorial are listed below. You can have a go at using a bias binding maker to either use a contrast binding on a plain fabric to get a really different finish around the neck. You can use it to make piping bias so that you can go around cushions if you like sewing homeware, or you can also use it to make little thin straps and ties. I hope you've learned something new today, and see you again soon.